Hi, this is Annie Grace, and welcome to this Naked Mind podcast. So I'm really excited for a lot of reasons. So Scott has been a podcast guest of mine before. Hi, Scott.
Hello, how's it going?
No, it's going good. And the coolest thing about today's podcast is that now Scott is no longer just a podcast guest, but he is somebody who is now at full-time work for this Naked Mind. He is, which I'm so excited. So Scott is sort of officially started out as, we really spent a lot of time together. I brought him through all the method. He'd been through it all himself. And he is my lead coach for kind of my most life-changing program, this Naked Mind Intensive. And that's been going amazing. And we've had this idea that what we do is we do live Q&A calls every single week with a group of incredible people who we bring through this program. And some of these questions are tough, and some of them take research, and some of them we have to dig into. And so we had this idea that these questions, they're so good, and people get so much out of these questions, that why don't we start just answering the coaching questions on a podcast? Take some of the hardest ones and throw them out there and toss them around, pull in the research that we did together to answer the questions for our Naked Mind participants, but also just for all of you, just to really, answer some of these tough questions the best we can. And so anyway, so Scott, first of all, so excited to have you part of all this. It's been awesome.
Yes, it has been fun. And I'm excited to start doing this podcast too. I think, there's a wide range of questions, but there are definitely some we tend to get repeatedly. And so I'd like people having access to that information. So this is good.
Yeah, it's so good. And it's so, the questions, they come up, and we'll do the tough ones, but we'll also, I think that's a great point, we'll also do the ones that just come up all the time, because, some of the ones that we are afraid to ask these questions, and we create this really safe space within the intensive. People actually ask them, and they realize everybody else is asking the same question. And I think that's one of the coolest parts of the program, is that you get into it, and kind of the aloneness you feel, the separation you feel because you're struggling with alcohol disappears within the length of the program, which is 3 months. But today's question, so this is a tough one. We're going to start out with one of the toughest ones. And I'm going to put a big disclaimer on here that we do not definitively know the answer to this question, nor does anybody. And so we are going to give, based on our knowledge, our research, kind of the most information we can, but I have to warn you, we don't intend to say, this is the answer to this question, because it's one that has been a subject of lots of debate for decades, for maybe probably even longer. So the question is alcohol addiction a disease, or is it not a disease? And so that's like a whopper to start with. But Scott, do you want to jump in, or should I jump in?
Sure. My answer is no, and thanks for listening.
Okay. My answer differs a little bit.
So there's a lot of different ways to look at this. And one of the things, one of the books that was key for me in my process was The Biology of Desire by Mark Lewis. And Mark talks a lot about this idea and sort of the history of how we've treated alcohol addiction, right? And that we used to look at it as this moral failing, right? It was just that you weren't strong enough. You weren't doing it right. If you were just a little more self-reliant, or if you were a little bit more responsible, or if you cared more, you wouldn't have this issue. And we obviously know that's not the case. And there's a lot of issues, and alcohol addiction isn't the only one we look at that way, or used to look at that way. So as time went on, there was this idea of, well, no, it's not that, it's a disease. So by calling it a disease, we remove this idea of, we remove this moral dimension from it. We remove this idea of fault. And so we look at the actual addiction of alcohol as a disease. That never really sat well with me. I never really understood that, because one of the ways that, I look at disease as an example, and I think we talk about in the book, Annie, you talk about there's no such thing as a cigarette-aholic or nicotine-aholic, right? But we know very well what the damage is that comes from smoking cigarettes over time. So we're well aware of that. So this idea that, being addicted to the substance is the disease was one that was kind of tough for me to swallow. And so I always kind of saw the disease part of alcohol addiction as the results, right? So how your body deteriorates under regular heavy use of the substance. So that's things like liver problems. We know that there's a lot of cancers associated with it. We also know that there's mental effects associated with it, depression and anxiety. I've seen those physical effects as the disease. To me, addiction as a process, I guess I just haven't seen the evidence that makes me think that's a disease. So that's kind of where I stand on it. And, I end up falling kind of, I'm always careful on how I say this. Like, I certainly don't see it as a moral failing of people, but I think there's a certain empowerment to saying, like, I'm here because I had drank and now I can get myself out. Right. And so I don't view it in a negative light, but I think it's also important to say, like, if people hadn't drank, they wouldn't be, where they are now. So by pointing that out, I think we really empower people to say, look, now you have the choice to move on. So I wouldn't say I fall in between the two. It's like a different definition altogether.
Yeah. And that totally makes sense. And I feel like it's funny because we first had this conversation, and I feel like we debated it a little bit, but then we really got to somewhere that's kind of in the middle. And I think that the thing that and a lot of the reason that I said we weren't going to answer this question is because I actually think the question itself is almost the wrong question. And I think you gave so much good history to why it's the wrong question. We had people who could not stop drinking. Their lives were falling apart despite all the evidence, despite, by the way, a deep personal desire to stop drinking, could not stop drinking. The medical establishment did not know what to do and they could not treat them. Enter the scene, Bill Wilson and Alcoholics Anonymous, and through meetings and through coming together and really working on the underlying causes of the trauma, the holes that we all have in ourselves, the reason that we numb in the first place. And by the way, the camaraderie, the taking away the shame because you're meeting other people who are like you instead of feeling completely isolated and alone, infusing community, which by the way, community is one of the most important things for humankind ever. All of a sudden, people who seemed helpless by the medical establishment got help and were changing and were staying away from alcohol, and their lives were changing. They were putting themselves back together. They were becoming incredible, productive people in society. And so the medical establishment said, wow, okay, this is not something that we can deal with. This is something that is actually being dealt with better outside of the medical establishment. And so it's split. And then since then, really in court systems, whenever somebody has a problem, they're not referred in necessarily to a hospital or to a medical place. They're referred into this alternative program that's, built by people, run by people, and that is not in a medical basis. And I think the idea of, okay, well, let's bring it back into the medical world. Really, like you said, it was like the pendulum swung the other way, because all of a sudden, when you're treating something with this spiritual malady, this moral malady, you are really increasing the burden on the individual. And I always say this all the time, but alcohol and every other addictive substance, they're addictive to us because we're human beings, because we have blood and flesh and cells and bones, and because we breathe and because our brains work a certain way. And there has never been proven, we can never find and test for some certain segment of the population who becomes addicted. In fact, when they've given addictive substances to rats, 100% of them become addicted. It's not that some segment who can't control themselves or have a spiritual failing or have a moral failing or have some type of physical component is the people that become addicted, and then everybody else does not. And so that for me really says, okay, actually, by saying that it's spiritual and moral, we're putting the burden on the individual. That is just wrong, because actually human beings become addicted under the right length, exposure, circumstance. And then also by then saying it's completely a disease, that doesn't necessarily ring entirely true because of basically the definition of disease. And so the definition of disease, which we have to bring in here because it wouldn't be a good conversation otherwise, from Merriam-Webster, is a condition of the living animal or plant body or one of its parts that impairs normal functioning and is typically manifested by distinguishing signs and symptoms. So an infectious disease, a rare genetic heart disease. So that's definition one. There's another definition that I think is really interesting because it doesn't have to do with the body, but I think it actually could make a case for alcohol addiction being a bit more of a disease, and that is a harmful development as in a social situation. And so the harmful development, or it's not necessarily, social situation is actually in parentheses in that definition. So it's not necessarily that that's the crux of it, but the harmful development. And so what happens, and I really like to look at it as kind of, it is a disease and it isn't a disease. Because if you look at something like type 1 and type 2 diabetes, right? One type is something that is a condition. And so that first definition, a condition of a living animal or plant body, that is a condition that you've been born with, the condition happens, there you are. And I think that's where we make the mistake, is if we say, okay, we were born with this propensity to become addicted to alcohol, and therefore it's a disease. That does not ring true. The science does not back that up. But equally, if you say it's a harmful development, definition number 2 of disease, that comes as a result of repeatedly drinking alcohol, then that rings completely true. And Scott, I think to your point, then you say all of these things that came out of me drinking too much certainly felt like, in a big way, like it was a disease in my life. It was infecting and every area of what was happening with me. And I think it's similar to like type 1 and type 2 diabetes. One is something that you're born with, and another is something that over time, through exposure to eating the wrong foods, is a society, like our conditioning and what we've exposed our bodies to manifests this type of illness. And so I think very similarly, if you cannot be born and never have a drink of alcohol and become addicted to alcohol, like you just can't. Like that's not, with the exception, by the way, of you being in utero and being exposed to alcohol, fetal alcohol syndrome, which of course then you are actually exposed to alcohol. So that even makes the argument more. But if you're never, as a human being, your cells were never exposed to alcohol, you will not be addicted to alcohol. So like, as a condition that is pre-existing, like that doesn't make sense. You're not going to be born with it like a rare genetic disease. However, it is more like an infectious disease where if you are exposed to it, then yes, over time, alcohol can change your brain to the point where over decades and decades of heavy drinking, you cannot function in the way that you used to before you stop drinking, even when you stop drinking. And just so nobody's afraid, that is a very, very tiny infinitesimal part of the population. And it is over so much drinking over so long that most listeners are not going to fall into that. In fact, according to the CDC, only 10% of people who excessively drink alcohol are actually clinically addicted to alcohol. And even of the people clinically addicted, only a percentage of them have actually gone to deteriorate the structure of their brain to the point where it is irreparable. So there's hope for 99% of us in that way. But yes, over time, as an infectious disease can break down the entire body, alcohol over time can break down the brain to where the condition is very disease-like. And so my answer is on kind of both sides of the fence, I guess.
I get that. I understand that. I want to go back to something before we pass on, but I think that one of the things, about AA that they deserve major credit for is kind of cracking open the door. Now, the way that the big book's written, it's a little bit different. I think we understand it differently now. We don't call it an allergy like they do in the big book. But man, do they deserve credit for removing that moral aspect of it. So I just wanted to make that point, because to me, that's such a huge development in sort of the way we think about things. I don't want to gloss over that. Now, and I hear what you're saying in terms of an infectious disease. I get that idea, and I've thought about it from that perspective before. But again, like the addiction itself is the mechanism through which people continue to drink. But I think because I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. So, as an infectious disease, something like, I don't know, malaria, let's use that as an example. So something like malaria, you catch that from the environment and you continue, you move on, you get treated and you move on with your life. With alcohol, I think that to me, the idea of calling the addiction itself the disease instead of the effects of the drinking the disease is that it's sort of this repeated exposure idea. Like this is happening. And like I said, like for me, a big part of that is people saying, look, I had a hand in this. Like, I don't know anyone who deliberately got malaria. Like, maybe there are, maybe people doing experiments, but like in general, like that's the idea. And I think, to me, like really the heart of the issue, you know, and you know, I'm kind of coming over to your side on seeing it on both sides of the coin there. But I think the heart of the issue is some element of, you know, personal action and responsibility in both ways. You know, like if you look at having an alcohol problem as a disease, and how most people end up treating it, is most people treat it outside of this medical facilities, right? Most people end up treating it, you know, either by working with us or going to Alcoholics Anonymous or any smart recovery, any of the myriad of programs that are out there. You know, that's to sort of stop getting infected again, right? I see that differently than actual repeated exposure, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes a ton of sense. And I think that what you just said is actually one of the clarifying missing pieces, right? Like, what aspect of this spectrum are we talking about? Are we talking about the addiction and the cycle of addiction and repeating the behavior and being able to stop repeating the behavior? Or are we talking about the outcome and the effects, which manifest very much like a disease, like the outcome of drinking for 40 years every single day and actually changing your brain so you don't have as many dopamine receptors? Like, that's both definitions of the disease, that condition that's manifested with signs and symptoms fits, and the harmful development fits, right? But so we can both probably say, okay, the effects physically of alcohol manifest like a disease, pretty much no question, in the physical body. The psychological, and by the way, what this naked mind is completely built on, is this idea that by understanding the addictive nature, we can consciously regain our control and power, because we as human beings have something that the rats they're experimenting on, where 100% of them get addicted, don't have. And that's why 100% of humans don't get addicted. We have this ability to reason and logic and say, wait a second, this is not doing me any favors. This train that I'm on is about to crash, and I'm going to get off before it does. And I think that's like a massive clarification. And I agree with you 100% that the addictive cycle that is psychological, the thing that keeps us doing it, until you reach that 10%, that 1% of people who have manifested such intense physical symptoms. Like my sister-in-law's mother died in the hospital from alcoholism. And she had to be given alcohol intravenously to extend her life as long as it did for the people she loved to say goodbye. And that was a point where alcohol had changed her body so much that it was not psychological anymore. But that's not true for 90% of excessive drinkers. So that's probably not true for 99% of drinkers overall, right? But if we talk about then that, and I think this brings up, actually, Scott and I, we had a coaching call last night, which was really, really, really cool. And one of the people on the call obviously protect anonymity, so I'm not going to say their name, but they said, when they are out of their house in environments where they're teaching, where they're learning, where they can give it up, no problem. It's completely easy. Just walk away from alcohol for weeks at a time. However, and what the question was phrased is that if there's external control on my behavior, meaning I'm with a peer group that is not necessarily condoning it, I'm learning, I'm at a retreat, I'm at some other location where it's externally controlled, and those were their words, then I can do it. But when it's my internal control, then I have a problem, and then I start drinking again. And the conversation we had with them was, there's really, in this situation, if you are walking away from alcohol for 12, 15 days with zero side effects, which, by the way, this person, they went to their doctor and they got a prescription just in case they were going to have withdrawals, because they were afraid that maybe they would, and walked away for 15 days, zero side effects, zero withdrawal symptoms, very clear that there's no physical aspect to their addiction. And if they can do that, and it's not that they were walking into a situation where alcohol wasn't available, by the way. So that I would agree was external control. If you are in like a lockdown center where you can't drink. No, it was just a situation where because of other circumstances, they were choosing not to. That was not external control. That was completely internal control. And I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that if we give up our power by saying, this is a disease, this is something out of my control, this is something that happened to me, this is something I was born with, we undermine consciously and subconsciously our own ability to take back control.
That is exactly, I love that when you said that on the call last night. And that's kind of, I feel the same way around the definition of alcohol as a disease or not a disease. This idea that, I'm somehow different or that I'm wired differently. And that's why, like, we know that there's differences in how long it takes someone to get to addiction. Like we know that that's different for everyone. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that are environment and genetics and a lot of things kind of jumbled up that we don't necessarily have the best answer for. But what we do know is that everyone can do it eventually. Like, and this is something I tell my clients too, like, it doesn't matter who you are. You drink enough alcohol over a long enough period of time and you will end up with a level of addiction. Like that's just how it works. And one of the things that Mark Lewis says about it in the biology is desire, is that he calls it the neural circuitry of desire governs anticipation, focused attention, and behavior. And we hijack that. And we actually end up putting our brains, addiction in one sense of the word is your brain doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's getting this dopamine hit. It's having you chase that. It's having you go back to that. So if we do this, if we have this, this idea of drinking and this idea of us being in control, like in order to take control, to get ourselves out of it, there's an element of taking responsibility for getting ourselves into it. And that's a fine line to ride because I don't like to be, I have no moral judgment of that. I know what it is. And like you said, Annie, it's just being human. The reason that we're here is because we're human. And, but I think there still is that element to it. And so talking about someone always have it, like external control not being a thing that really exists. Like at that time, when she was on that trip, she was in control. Maybe she felt like she was giving that up, but ultimately every night, every time, even she had a thought about drinking or decided or thought about maybe going out, she was exerting that internal control. And I think, that was a really powerful lesson to say, like, you did that, you can do this for a couple of weeks at a time. Like there's no reason you can't do it at home. And it was clear from her reaction that that was kind of a revelation. Like that was like a, oh yeah, sort of a moment.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that was really cool. I mean, I'm really hopeful because I feel that was, and I think for so many of us, it holds us back. We think that there's some secret that we're not getting, some mindset shift, some instance that we're not getting. And when we understand, wait a second, we do have the power. And I love what you said, Scott. And I think that's really where it is that this idea of taking personal responsibility. And I like to separate personal responsibility with, you may have been through the most traumatic experiences. Your life may be in shambles. All of this stuff may happen. These things are not necessarily your fault. Getting addicted to an addictive substance in a society that puts it as a higher level of importance than anything else we consume, really, that's not really your fault, but it is your responsibility because your life is your responsibility and nobody else's. And I think it's so empowering to say, understand the science, understand it and say, wait a second, it's not that there's something wrong with me. It's that just as you said, Scott, my brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Exactly what it was designed to do. And that mechanism of becoming addicted is your brain responding to stimulus exactly as it's supposed to keep you alive. Unfortunately, the stimulus it's responding to is highly addictive in nature, and your brain does not know that because but your conscious mind, it does. And so it's taking your brain working neurochemically exactly how it's supposed to, realizing, wait a second, that's exactly how it's supposed to for things like, not things like 40 proof vodka and other stuff like that, but working exactly how it's supposed to for normal levels of dopamine stimulation. And then taking this idea of, but wait a second, I can understand that. And by understanding it, I can put a wrench in this and I can stop and I can reevaluate my decisions.
Yeah, and that's where, so I'm a big student of Stoic philosophy, and that's where I start to talk with people about the difference between reacting and responding. Right, those are two different things. We might use those words sort of interchangeably, but running into a situation, into a stressful situation, whereas before we may have reacted with getting a drink, people begin to understand that they can choose how they respond. They can choose how they do it, and so this idea that we talk about the mindset shift quite a bit. I think that's a big part of that mindset shift is like, this is in my hands. Like I actually am in the driver's seat. And that's an extremely optimistic message.
Yeah, it's huge. And so I think we didn't answer the question.
No, we didn't.
We don't know if alcohol is a disease and alcohol.
We didn't promise to, though. I think that's fair.
But I think we really brought up a better question, which is what definition serves you? And are you being served by believing that you were born with something that you cannot change? Or are you being served by believing that, hey, my brain is actually working exactly how it's supposed to work, and the effects that I have brought on myself, that definition number 2 from Merriam-Webster, the harmful development that has happened in my life as a result of drinking, is actually something that I can reverse. Because I'm not a mouse, because I have this incredibly powerful part of my brain, the prefrontal cortex, that can help me make these good decisions going forward with understanding and knowledge. And so I love this question. I love this debate. This was so much fun. I do think that the better question is to say, what's serving me and how am I moving forward with the decisions and choices I want to make, and not to get caught up in the semantics of it. Because ultimately, unless your definition of where you are with this is helping you to live the best life that you want to live, it might not be a question worth your time.
I completely agree with that, because the definition, it's fun to get into the semantics and to look at the research and to debate the different sort of viewpoints on this. But ultimately, the important thing is what works. What works to keep you alcohol free, or living with alcohol in the way that you want to. What is that? Is it a book? Is it a group? Is it a program? Finding that and engaging in it and being able to actually live in the way you want to live is the important part.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, this has been so much fun. I look forward to lots more hard coaching questions on this podcast. So yeah, thank you, Scott.
Very good. Thank you, Annie. This was fun. I agree.
This has been Annie Grace with This Naked Mind podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You can learn more at thisnakedmind.com. And please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, as it really helps us spread the word.